Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Albert Chiu. As the U.S.-China trade talks remains at a standstill and tensions rise in the global trade markets, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has visited Vietnam and the Philippines. Meanwhile, Japan's ruling coalition has also made rare consecutive visits to China, drawing significant international attention. Bloomberg noted that such a series of diplomatic moves toward China in a short period is infrequent for Japan, signaling potential shifts. How should we interpret the changing geopolitical landscape under President Trump's tariff war? Joining us today are Charles Wu, National Zhenjiang University Department of Diplomacy Professor and Chair, and Wendy Song, Atlantic Council Global China Hub Non-Resident Fellow. A very warm welcome to both on the show.
Hello, Albert.
Although President Donald Trump has suspended the additional 24% tariff on Japanese imports, a 10% baseline tariff remains in place. Japan has been reported as being among the first countries to negotiate reciprocal tariffs with the Trump administration. The progress and outcome of the U.S.-Japan talks are widely seen as a litmus test for whether Trump's tariff negotiation strategy will succeed. My first question is that Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba visited to Southeast Asia at this time point, starting with Vietnam just 2 weeks after Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit seems highly strategic. So, Charles, what's your take on this political consideration might be behind this move?
First of all, we can say Japan and Vietnam, they have very close, tight cooperation, no matter on for example, foreign direct investments, foreign aid, or trade. For example, Japan is the largest trade ODA provider for Vietnam. It's about 20 billion US dollars. Also, it's the third largest investors in Vietnam, Japan, accounted by 5,500 projects. The multilateral kind of bilateral trade relation is also very high. Japan is the fourth largest trade partner with Vietnam. In 2024, it counted 46 billion US dollars. So we can say this time Japanese Prime Minister met with Vietnam Prime Minister. They talk about maintain very good and stable trade relationship. Second thing is I think this time Japan Prime Minister visit Vietnam and also the South Asia is want to kind of show Japan's influence and also they're kind of cautious about China's expansion in South China Sea issues, no matter in economic or security sections. For example, for the kind of called regional integration, I think Japan is a very, very important kicking engine for RCEP and also CPTPP. And some countries, they overlap between these two regional integration mechanisms. And Japan want to mention again, they will never leave from these areas and they will strengthen their impacts on these regional integrations. For security issues, I think South China Sea is also Japan's focus. They don't want any kind of tensions between Southeastern countries and with China. Likewise, say this is very important when Ishiba visit Southeast Asia because we know also Korea, they try to provide more this kind of economic or trade assistance to Southeast Asia countries. And Japan kind of compete against South Korea in these areas, no matter how. So for us, I'm saying if, like I say, Trump is kind of withdrawing from these areas, focus on U.S. priority or mega, while Japan want to take more kind of roles in this area.
Well, one thing you did not mention, which I would like Wendy to answer, is that Chinese President Xi Jinping actually visited Vietnam a while ago as well. This happened before Ishiba's visit to Vietnam. So what kind of calculation, to your perspective, do you think that Xi Jinping would like to woo Vietnam, if you will, to his side, especially in the context of the U.S.-China trade war still going on?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Charles just said, basically. And I think, yes, we need to look at this in a broader context of the U.S.-China strategic shift, especially in terms of both greater geopolitical uncertainty from the U.S. side, as well as Xi Jinping's recent trip to Southeast Asia, which happened roughly 2 weeks before Ishiba's own visit to Southeast Asia as well. And I think what Japan is trying to do is basically to hedge. It's trying to, A, buy insurance, B, help out U.S. a little bit within reason, and C, doing it so without exactly alienating Beijing. I think that's a calculus they have in mind here. By that, I mean that, yes, Japan also is concerned about much more conditional support from the U.S. towards Japan, as well as towards the region in general. What that means for Japan is that Japan will need to find ways to secure its own backing in its own region, and that includes strengthening relations between Japan and Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, for example. And doing so at a time when Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries are concerned about more questionable U.S. support for the region, Japan, being one of America's best friends for sure, being there to help out is going to inject some confidence back into these countries at this particular juncture as well. That's what I mean by Japan trying to help out U.S. a little bit. But it's trying to do so in a way that doesn't exactly alienate Beijing because yes, it's injecting confidence at the time when Xi Jinping just visited Southeast Asia and strengthened China relation with them. Japan is putting weight on the other side of the ledger to counterbalance it a little bit. By doing it in a way that's not directly confrontational, it's definitely has a security component, but oftentimes this increase in security relation between Japan and Vietnam and Philippines come as a positive rather than a negative framing. Like there was no explicit mention, for example, about anything about countering a China threat, for example, although they do loosely talk about much more general concerning potential infraction to regional norms, e.g. freedom of navigation, e.g. Territorial integrity, blah, 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 blah. So those are framed in normative terms rather than country-specific threat terms. And that's what I mean by Japan helping out itself, helping out U.S., but doesn't exactly rub Beijing the wrong way.
Mm-hmm. During Ishiba's visit, Japan and Vietnam agreed to strengthen cooperation in maritime defense, driven by growing concerns over China's threats in the East China Sea. From Japan's perspective, could security cooperation with Vietnam be seen as part of a broader military efforts to build alliances to counter China?
Yeah, when we talk about Vietnam, first, Vietnam, they use a very important foreign policy we call the bamboo policy, bamboo strategy, which means on the bottom they are kind of very steady, while on the top they kind of, they go with the wings.
Is that kind of like a hedging policy as well?
Yeah, I mean, when we study hedge, it's typically very fitting into the hedging policy. When we talk about hedge, basic definition is, for example, is it between balancing or bandwagon, or you put like economic bargaining chip in one power, while you separate security on another one. When we look at Vietnam, they're typically using the hedge for a certain period of time and also for long decades. For example, on the trade relations, Vietnam government, they maintain very close trade relations with Beijing because they view China as their major economic trade markets. China right now is their major trading partners with Vietnam's. However, like we said, the love and hate in the South China Sea issues is making the Vietnam government, they're really cautious about China's military and also their security expansion in these areas. This is where Japan, they really got in the areas because Japan knows that. Japan knows the economic relation between Beijing and Vietnam, they are very close. While Japan, they also want to play a very important role in, like I mentioned, RCEP or CPTP, these kind of regional integrations. So Japan wants to use China, South Korea as their first step, so we call the China, Japan, South Korea, this kind of three trilateral cooperation framework, and they get into the ASEAN plus 10, plus 6, the framework, and become the RCEP. So that's why I say Japan, they knows it, and they also want to get involved with this kind of we call South Asian politics. So Japan, they also have very important, we call the propaganda or slogan. They call it, we want to switch from ODA to OSA, which means you are not only get Japan's, we call financial assistance or official development assistance, while we also provide you certain kind of security assistance by providing some small-scale weapons for your national defense. And who is the target? Probably, we're talking about the potential threats from mainland China.
Okay, Wendy, now we are talking about Japanese Prime Minister going to the Southeast Asia. That means that you have this Japan, maybe including the South Korea elements that kind of intertwine with the Southeast Asia countries, right? So help us to assess the Japan's current position because obviously Japan is caught between Washington and Beijing. So what risks, to your perspective, does Japan face on both the military and the economic fronts?
Right, I think for Japan, it's definitely living in a moment of fear of abandonment, as one of the leading Korea expert, Victor Cha, used to say. It's one of the book's titles that he offered. And I think for many Asian allies and partners and friends of America, that's an anxiety many are living with at the moment, and Japan is no exception, especially given that we know that the U.S.-Japan alliance is one of the cornerstones of anything Japan does internationally, especially in foreign security policy. So on that part, it's pretty straightforward. I think what Japan wants to do at this juncture is to still, not give up on relation with U.S. because still among the two main superpowers in the world, U.S. and China, U.S. still the one that has a longer standing positive relation with Japan. But B is trying to do so in a way that doesn't close doors with China, and meanwhile is trying to strengthen itself both through domestic security measure as well both through external security alignment building. And that's why you're seeing externally now with Japan signing new defense security cooperation agreements with both Vietnam and Philippines during this trip. Domestically, we talk about fear of abandonment, and what that means for Japan is that they're a bit less than before in terms of certainty about how dependable U.S. support is on the security front. And so you are seeing an interesting development about a month ago when you see Japan side announcing that they are forming a new Joint Operations Command to better integrate Japan's various military services or SDF's self-defense forces various services as a way to strengthen Japan's own defense capacity, at least at organizational level, before the budgetary level kicks in. So I think that's what Japan is doing. And of course, do these add up to a more explicit China unfriendly posture? I wouldn't say so. What we're seeing a lot is Japan trying to do things in a more positive framing. Japan and Vietnam, for example, they are announcing on the security front, let's do more together. But against whom? Maybe we don't need to spell it out.
Japan's cross-party Japan-China Friendship Parliamentarian Union also made a visit to Beijing, okay? A move widely seen as a highly unusual. What political significance lies behind this visit? This is very provocative. Media actually reports that the delegation delivered a handwritten letter from Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba to Chinese President Xi Jinping. Does this reflect Japan's flexible, diplomacy strategy, Charles?
Yeah, when we talk about Ishiba's China's policy, we find that he tried to use more balanced foreign policy or China policy, comparing his previous terms prime ministers, because we should still remember when he met with Xi last November, Ishiba tried to mention that a stabilized and more peaceful regional stability is very important for both powers. It's very important for both Japan and China. And Ishiba also tried to stay away from the Taiwan issues when he meeting with Xi. So first thing we can say, Ishiba is very clever. He knows how to manipulate the bilateral relations between China and Japan and stay away from the red line.
Well, I mean, you can say that Ishiba is very clever, but you can also argue that he's not as close to the United States, especially Donald Trump, as opposed to, say, Shinzo Abe, right? When Shinzo Abe was still alive, he was like, without any hesitation to embrace the Trump administration. So that wins some hearts from Trump, and Trump was willing to help Japan in many different fronts. So now, help us to kind of reflect this question a little bit more about if Ishiba is taking this kind of strategy, what kind of possible reaction from Trump you think to him?
I mean, we still need to go back to a very important the systematic framework between Sino-US relations, because we call this kind of unstable intensifying Sino-US relations, which create huge impacts on all the East Asian countries, including South Korea and Japan. This is why Ishiba has this kind of reactions. He doesn't really, for example, we talk about that. He doesn't really trust the United States, no matter it's in security or economic commitments. This is very important. This is why push Ishiba is, we are not turning to China, but he more pro or lean to China, especially on we call the trade or economic perspective. especially when Trump mentioned about the 25% of tariffs on Japan, focusing on automobile and vehicle sectors. I think this, as Ishiba, try to say something or at least show his attitudes. So I mean, this is very kind of straightforward reactions from Japan's governments. They show more close lean to China's negotiation. However, I want to say that the China policy we should not be too naive on Japan's China policy because there's still a lot of unsolved issues between China and Japan.
Right. Yeah. Quick response to the same question, please.
The question is Japan turning towards China?
Right.
Okay. Well, I mean, Japan, flexible diplomacy, that's a straightforward approach to take, as Chiu kind of mentioned as well. I think it's probably a little bit too early to jump the gun here into calling it a turn of Japan towards China, for example. I think what we're looking at really is more of a not a term, maybe a rebalancing. At the time, of course, between the two potential great power patterns, when patron A seems to be less dependable, naturally you try to go easier on patron B. That's sort of a natural way people behave. And what it means for Japan, I think, is that Japan wants to make sure it maximizes the number of friends and minimize the number of adversaries. And so you are seeing warming relations between Japan and China somewhat to some extent. And I think Trump itself would not be too unhappy about that as well, in part because Trump is much more interested in transactional diplomacy as a way to extract concessions, often on a country-by-country, case-by-case basis. Trump largely seems to be not that interested in an ideological either-or binary Cold War framework, in which case, for Trump, China having somewhat better relation with Japan does not have to come at the expense of U.S.-Japan relations. And so in that sense, it actually gives Japan a bit more room to maneuver as well. And I think Japan's happy to explore that option, which is why you're seeing at the moment when Japan sends prime minister to tour Vietnam and Philippines, it's also sending the leader of LDP, the leader of Kuomintang, which is the junior partner in Japan ruling coalition. Kuomintang's leader visiting Beijing, as well as hand-delivering a personal letter from Japan Prime Minister. That's how Japan plays a balancing game, and I think Trump will be okay with that for now.
Okay, and not to mention that Trump is very concerned about the United States spending too much money on defending Japan against China. Trump, of course, wants Japan to take care of that part on their own more. Okay, according to a Bloomberg report, Japanese officials believe that if the United States tries to pull Japan into a trade bloc aimed at countering China, Japan plans to resist. The main reason is that China remains Japan's largest trading partner and a crucial source of goods and raw materials. Some U.S. media have framed this development as Japan turning towards China. Again, let's comment on this still a little bit deeper. Is there really a possibility out there that Japan turning to China? You go first, please.
Japan wants, at this point, to maximize its options on its side of the table. And so in that sense, a clear-cut, irreversible turn towards China at the expense of relation with the U.S. is definitely not in Japan's interest. And at the moment, along this same logic of building more leverages on Japan's side is why you're seeing Japan is improving relation with China, e.g., recently, you see that China, Japan, South Korea trilateral high-level meeting when they issue a joint statement that talk about things, including all three sides are pledging to continue support and reinvigoration of RCEP, for example, RCEP, as a way to drive regional economic integration. That surfaces because Japan wants to both improve its position. It wants also to buy insurance in the event that U.S.-led regional economic integration alternatives, such as IPEF, such as what used to be CPTPP, now it's much more questionable. In case those U.S.-friendly options are less available, Japan wants to make sure that it gets a greater say at the current ASEAN-led options, like RCEP, for example. And you see Japan also improving relations with Southeast Asia, e.g., OSA, ODA, Vietnam, Philippines, for example, all these are ways for Japan to find ways to make sure that Japan's continued economic presence in the region is felt, that where possible, it also locks these regional countries onto a trajectory that will lead to greater potential defense, security, maybe economic integration with Japan. Again, not so much a turn towards China and away from America, but as a way to improve Japan's own hands.
Okay, Charles, China continues to ban imports of Japanese seafood and beef. As you mentioned, there's still some kind of paradox between China and Japan. A retaliatory move against Japan's release of treated wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear plants. This issue remains a major point of tension between the two countries. So is Beijing now considering easing these restrictions to win Japan over?
I would say Japan and China, they have several unsolved issues, no matter in we call conflicting women issues, historical books issues,
right.
Those kind of we call traditional subjects between these two countries. However, if you observe the bilateral relations these days, they kind of lower down these kind of tunes and they focus on kind of more normal dialogue between the two leaders. Like what I say, last November when Xi and Ishiba met, they have a summit in Peru. Ishiba tried to stay away from Taiwan issue. I think this is very, very important because they want to resume their normal trade. China used to use the Fukushima issues to ban Japan's seafood or beef, which create a huge impact on Japanese exports. So this is, I think, Ishiba really want to bring this down to the negotiating table. He wants to tell Xi, let's talk about focus on trade, because now the major critical problem is not from Beijing, is tariffs provided by Trump. Also, like I said, Japan, they really want to go back to recover the regional integrations scheme or platforms, and they really want to show they can responsible as a responsible stakeholder in these areas, try to promote more close regional integrations, bring Southeast Asian countries and China into we call the regional integration or spaghetti ball. And probably the United States cannot play any kind of role in this kind of regional integration because if they're still playing around the tariffs. So like I said, I'm still kind of optimistic between China and Japan in the future on certain kind of issues, if Japan don't touch on Taiwan.
Okay, so Taiwan issue is a controversial hotspot out there that Japan, maybe the Ishiba administration, dare not to touch. However, a follow-up for you still, Charles, is that in 2023, the United States overtook China to become Japan's largest export markets, a lead it maintained last year. For Japan, the U.S. market remains critical, especially in terms of automobile exports. A lot of American consumers love Japanese cars. Given these factors, is it fair to say that abandoning the United States is not really an option for Japan?
Japan will never abandon the United States because in 2024, the United States accounted about 141 billion US dollars on Japan's exports cars, which means 1/3 of Japan's cars exported to the United States. So,
and some of them were even made in the United States. Like Toyota, Honda.
They're building new factories in the United States. And in 2023, Japan also exported approximately 41 billion worth of vehicles to the United States. So for the past 2 years, United States is the major destination for Japanese cars. Like I said, this year we also know that Toyota and they try to invest $88 million US dollars in West Virginia and try to create their own power systems and provide the goods to the car manufacturing. So United States is a very important target and markets for Japanese vehicles. So the issue about whether Japan will abandon the United States, I don't think so.
Economically,
no.
Impossible.
Especially when we bring the security or political issues in. The U.S., Japan, the security alliances, which even is asymmetric alliances, but Japan still heavily dependent on United States security fulfillment and security commitments. Their long history cooperation between Washington and Tokyo is we call it ironclad. So the issue about whether Japan will abandon the United States, I don't think it's a real issues. But however, like what I say, Ishiba is playing around the politics. He knows right now if there's more uncertainties or instabilities between Japan and Trump administrations, he will turn around to see Beijing whether he can get more benefits from Beijing.
Wendy, is it fair for me to argue that since now ideological alliance or this kind of military confrontation is secondary for not only Trump, but also Ishiba, and maybe also for Xi Jinping. So they all would turn their attention to transactional diplomacy, kind of follow the path of Donald Trump's kind of mindsets. So that Taiwan would not kind of issue in the front burner, nor is the South China Sea issue. So what's your kind of evaluation of this kind of argument that transactional policy now is more like popular, among these countries?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like both major power, Chinese diplomacy has often been transactional in nature for a long time as well, with the few exceptions, e.g. on Taiwan issue and One China principle issue, for example, in its foreign dealings. The U.S. used to be a lot more direct about upholding so-called liberal international order and underscoring the word liberal. Of course, under Biden, we saw slight changes when they gradually replaced the mention of liberal international order into something else, which is rules-based international order. And that rules implies stability, predictability, rules beyond immediate case-by-case interest, for example. Now that we have Trump administration back in power, it's less clear if it's things that are binding rules that ought to regulate not just other people's behavior, but also America's own behavior as well. In that case, yes, we seem to be moving towards a much more realist world internationally. What that is going to entail is a lot more uncertainty. When there are no rules, it's harder to set consistent, longer-standing agenda and expectation as what happens of cooperation. And that's why we think all these countries, they are scrambling to find more external partners, especially partners outside of China and the US, the big two.
Wendy and Charles, thank you for your great insights in the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Like our show, subscribe to Talks. See you next time.